I never thought I'd be standing in the corner of my own daughter's wedding reception, feeling like a stranger in my own family. But there I was, watching Sarah laugh with her new husband, David, surrounded by his wealthy relatives, while I stood alone by the gift table like some unwelcome guest who'd wandered in from the street. The irony wasn't lost on me. 25 years ago, when Sarah was just 3 years old and her father had just passed away from cancer, I made a promise to myself. I would give that little girl everything I never had. Everything. Even if it meant sacrificing everything I'd built. You see, before I became known as Sarah's unemployed mother, I was Margaret Thompson, CEO and founder of Thompson Construction. We weren't just another small construction company. We built half of downtown Chicago. Those gleaming office towers, the luxury condos overlooking Lake Michigan, the shopping centers that became city landmarks. My crews built them. My vision designed them. My signature was on contracts worth millions. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the 3-year-old girl who used to sit in my office, coloring pictures while I reviewed blueprints. What mattered was making sure she never felt the sting of poverty I'd known growing up in a trailer park in Indiana, where dinner sometimes meant splitting a can of soup between 3 people. I remember the day I made the decision. Sarah was 7, and she'd come home from her private school. Yes, I'd already started making sacrifices by then, talking about her friend Emma's mother who was a doctor. "Mama," she'd said, her little face so serious. "Emma says her mommy saves people's lives. What do you do that's important?" I'd been working 18-hour days for weeks, trying to close a deal on the biggest project of my career, a 40-story office complex that would have set us up for life. But looking at my daughter's innocent face, I realized I was already missing her life. The late nights, the weekend site visits, the constant phone calls. I was building a business empire, but losing the only thing that truly mattered. That night, after tucking Sarah into bed, I sat in my home office surrounded by architectural drawings and financial projections. The company was worth $12 million. Sarah's education, from private elementary school through medical school if she wanted it, would cost maybe $500,000. The math was simple. I could give her the world and still have enough left over to live comfortably forever. So I sold it. Thompson Construction, my life's work, my identity, my legacy, gone in 6 months. I kept the sale quiet, told everyone I was taking a break from the business world to focus on family. I invested the money wisely, creating a portfolio that would generate enough passive income to support us both for the rest of our lives. But I never told Sarah any of this. To her, I simply became mom who used to work in construction but now stays home. As she got older and her friends' mothers climbed corporate ladders and earned prestigious titles, I watched her sometimes look at me with what I feared might be disappointment. But I convinced myself it was worth it when I could attend every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. I was there when she cried over her first heartbreak at 15. I was there to help her with calculus homework at midnight when she was struggling junior year. I was there to drive her to college visits across 3 states. And I was there to hold her when she was scared about leaving home for Northwestern University. Those years weren't easy. Living on a strict budget while sitting on millions, money I couldn't touch without revealing the truth, meant saying no to things I could have easily afforded. When Sarah wanted to go on expensive school trips, I had to budget carefully, make it seem like we were stretching to afford it. When she needed a car for college, I bought her a reliable used Honda, instead of the BMW I could have written a check for. But watching her graduate summa cum laude with a degree in marketing, watching her land her first job at a prestigious advertising firm, watching her build her own successful career, it was worth every sacrifice. She was confident, independent, successful. She'd never know the fear of not having enough, never experienced the anxiety that had driven me to work those brutal 18-hour days. Then David entered the picture. At first, I was thrilled. David Morrison was everything I thought Sarah deserved. Successful, charming, well-educated. He was a partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, came from a family of judges and politicians. When Sarah brought him home for dinner 2 years ago, he was polite, even charming. He asked thoughtful questions about my background, seemed genuinely interested when I mentioned my construction experience. "You must have some fascinating stories from that world," he'd said over my homemade lasagna. "Construction is such a tough industry. Takes real grit to succeed there." But something shifted after he proposed. Maybe it was when he started really looking at our modest apartment, my 10-year-old car, my simple wardrobe. Maybe it was when his parents started planning their engagement party and asked about my contribution, only to be told I'd prefer to keep it modest. Or maybe it was just who he really was underneath that charming exterior. The comments started small. "Sarah, don't you think your mother might be more comfortable if she found something to keep her busy? Volunteer work, maybe? Part-time retail?" He'd say it with a smile, but I could hear the judgment underneath. Then came the more direct suggestions. "Margaret, have you considered that Sarah might worry less about finances if you were contributing to the household?" This, despite the fact that I'd never asked Sarah for a penny and had actually been quietly covering her student loan payments without her knowledge. Sarah, caught between us, started to change too. She'd always called me every day, but the calls became less frequent. When she did call, there was a strain in her voice, like she was walking on eggshells. I could feel her pulling away, could sense David's influence growing stronger. The wedding planning was when things really deteriorated. David's family took charge of everything, the venue, the catering, the guest list. When I timidly suggested a few family friends I'd like to invite, David's mother, Constance, looked at me like I'd suggested inviting homeless people to dine at the country club. "Of course, Margaret, but we do need to be mindful of our guest count. Perhaps you could limit your list to immediate family?" The problem was, after 25 years of focusing entirely on Sarah, most of my old friends from the business world had fallen out of touch. My immediate family was basically just me. I found myself assigned to the table farthest from the head table, seated with David's great-aunt's caregiver and a few college friends Sarah barely spoke to anymore. When I asked Sarah about it, she gave me an excuse about balancing the room, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. The final blow came during the rehearsal dinner. David stood up to make a toast, thanking everyone who had contributed to making Sarah the successful woman she is today. He thanked his parents for their guidance, Sarah's professors for their wisdom, even his law firm for providing Sarah with networking opportunities. He never mentioned me. Not once. 25 years of sacrifice, and I was invisible. That night, lying alone in my hotel room, I wasn't invited to stay at the family estate like David's relatives. I almost called Sarah, almost told her everything, almost explained that the reason I seemed unsuccessful by David's standards was because I'd chosen her over everything else. But I couldn't. She was getting married in 12 hours, and I wouldn't ruin her happiness with my hurt feelings. So I put on my best dress, a simple navy blue outfit from Nordstrom Rack that I'd bought on sale, and went to watch my daughter marry a man who clearly saw me as an embarrassment. The ceremony was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant in her designer gown, and despite everything, my heart swelled with pride. This accomplished, confident woman was my daughter. Whatever else happened, I had succeeded in my most important job, but the reception was torture. I sat at my assigned table, making small talk with strangers while watching David's family hold court at the center of the room. I watched Sarah laugh at David's father's stories, watched her dance with David's uncles, watched her fit seamlessly into their world of old money and established connections. I was picking at my salmon when David appeared at my elbow with a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. "Margaret," David said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed condescension, "I'd like you to meet my boss, Harrison Mitchell. He's the senior partner at our firm." I stood up, extending my hand with a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Mitchell." David's next words hit me like a physical blow. Harrison, this is Sarah's mother. She's unemployed. Has been for years, actually. Basically just living off my fiancé at this point." He laughed, as if my situation was some kind of amusing anecdote. Bit of a loser, if I'm being honest. The words hung in the air like poison. I felt my face flush hot with humiliation, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to maintain my composure. Around our little group, conversations continued. Champagne glasses clinked, the band played on. But in that moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. David was still smiling, waiting for his boss to share in his amusement at my expense. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to defend myself, but no words came. How could I explain 25 years of choices in a single sentence? How could I tell this stranger that I wasn't a failure, but a mother who had chosen love over legacy? Then Harrison Mitchell's expression changed. He was looking at me more closely now, his head tilted slightly as if trying to place something. The casual smile faded from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. "Wait," he said slowly, his voice cutting through David's lingering chuckle. "Margaret Thompson? From Thompson Construction?" The question hit me like lightning. After all these years of being invisible, of being dismissed as just Sarah's unemployed mother, someone had recognized my name, my real name. Not the diminished version of myself I'd become, but who I used to be. I nodded slowly, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, that was my company. Harrison's face broke into a genuine smile. Not the polite social smile he'd worn when David introduced us, but real recognition and what looked almost like admiration. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, reaching out to shake my hand again, this time with both of his. "Margaret Thompson, it's an honor to meet you again." David's smile faltered. I could see confusion flickering across his features as he looked back and forth between his boss and me. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. His boss wasn't sharing in the joke about his fiancée's loser mother. Instead, Harrison Mitchell was treating me like someone important. "Again?" David asked, his voice uncertain now. Harrison turned to David with surprise. "You don't know? Your future mother-in-law built half of downtown Chicago. Thompson Construction was legendary in this city." He turned back to me, his expression warmth itself. "I bought my first office building from you about 15 years ago, the Morrison Building on Wacker Drive. Still one of the best investments I ever made." I felt something shift inside me, like a door I'd kept locked for decades was finally creaking open. "You were just starting out then," I said, my voice growing stronger. "Young lawyer looking to invest his first big bonus check." "That's right," Harrison laughed. "You spent 3 hours with me, explaining every aspect of the deal, making sure I understood exactly what I was getting into. You could have taken advantage of a naive kid with more money than sense, but instead, you made sure I made a smart investment. I've never forgotten that." David was staring at me now like he was seeing me for the first time. The casual contempt had evaporated from his expression, replaced by shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. But you said you used to work in construction," David stammered. "You never said you owned a company." "I didn't just own a company," Harrison interjected before I could respond. "Thompson Construction was one of the most respected firms in the Midwest. Margaret here was a legend, one of the few women to break into that boys' club and not just survive, but dominate." The conversation was drawing attention now. Other guests were turning to look, curious about what had caught their senior partner's interest so completely. I could see Sarah across the room, her head turning toward us with a puzzled expression. "What happened to the company?" Harrison asked gently. "I heard rumors that you'd sold, but nobody seemed to know why. You were at the top of your game." This was the moment. This was when I could have told the truth, could have explained to David and anyone else listening that I hadn't failed. I had chosen chosen my daughter over my empire, chosen love over legacy, chosen to be present for Sarah's childhood instead of building monuments to my own ambition. But looking at David's stunned face, seeing the way his entire worldview was crumbling as he realized he'd spent 2 years dismissing someone he should have respected, I found I didn't need to justify my choices to him or anyone else. I had more important things to focus on, I said simply, glancing toward Sarah, who was now making her way through the crowd toward us. Harrison followed my gaze, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your daughter," he said softly. "You gave it up for your daughter." "I didn't give up anything," I corrected him, my voice steady and sure. "I made an investment, the best one of my life." Harrison's words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything in an instant. "Nice to meet you again, partner." The word partner hit David like a physical blow. I watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning horror as he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd just done. His boss, the man whose approval he'd spent years cultivating, whose recommendation could make or break his career, was treating his unemployed loser future mother-in-law with the kind of respect reserved for industry legends. "Partner?" David's voice cracked slightly on the word. Harrison chuckled, seemingly oblivious to David's distress. "Well, business partner anyway. Margaret here didn't just sell me one building. Over the years, Thompson Construction handled at least a dozen projects for my investment group. Always on time, always under budget, always exceeding expectations." He turned back to me with genuine warmth. "I still drive by the Riverside complex sometimes. That mixed-use development you designed, pure genius. The way you maximize the footprint while maintaining green space. I've never seen anything like it." I felt a flush of pride I hadn't experienced in years. For so long, I'd been defined by what I wasn't. Not employed, not contributing, not successful by conventional measures. To hear my work praised by someone who understood its value was like water in a desert I hadn't realized I'd been wandering through. That project was challenging, I admitted, allowing myself to smile. The city zoning requirements were a nightmare, and the environmental restrictions meant we had to completely reimagine traditional construction methods. "But you pulled it off," Harrison said with admiration. "That complex has been the model for sustainable urban development in Chicago ever since. The mayor still points to it as an example of how private development can benefit entire communities." Sarah had reached us by now, slipping through the crowd with the kind of graceful confidence I'd always admired in her. She was beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness, but I could see confusion in her eyes as she took in the scene. Her new husband looking pale and shaken, his boss treating me like an old friend, and me standing straighter than I had in years. "Mom?" Sarah's voice held a question she didn't know how to ask. "Sarah," Harrison turned to her with delight. "You must be so proud of your mother. Do you realize what an incredible woman you have here?" Sarah looked between Harrison and me, her brow furrowed. Of course I'm proud of my mother, but I'm not sure I understand." David finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Sarah, did you know your mother owned a construction company?" "Well, yes," Sarah said slowly. "I mean, she worked in construction when I was little. She had her own small business, I think, but she gave it up to focus on raising me." She looked at me with the same fond but slightly pitying expression I'd grown accustomed to over the years. The look of a successful daughter who loved her mother but felt sorry for her limited ambitions. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Small business?" He laughed, but not unkindly. "Sarah, your mother's company built some of the most iconic structures in Chicago. Thompson Construction wasn't small. It was one of the top firms in the Midwest. Margaret was one of the most respected contractors in the industry." I watched my daughter's face as Harrison's words sank in. The confusion deepened, followed by a flicker of something that might have been hurt. "Mom, is that true?" The moment stretched between us, full of 25 years of careful omissions and deliberate simplifications. I told myself I was protecting her, shielding her from the weight of my sacrifice. But looking at her now, I realized I might have been protecting myself too, from having to explain a choice that had sometimes felt impossible to justify even to myself. Thompson Construction was successful, yes, I said carefully, but that was a long time ago, sweetheart. How successful? David's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the dread in it. Harrison answered before I could. When Margaret sold the company, it was valued at around $12 million. That was 15 years ago. In today's market, a firm like Thompson Construction would probably be worth twice that. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the band seemed to fade into background noise as the implications of Harrison's words settled over our little group. $12 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation, reframing every interaction, every assumption, every casual dismissal of the past 2 years. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, her engagement ring catching the light as her fingers trembled. 12. Mom, you never said. Because it didn't matter, I said quietly. The money was never the point. But even as I said it, I could see David's mind racing, calculating. His face had gone from pale to ashen as he processed what he'd just learned. For 2 years, he'd treated me like a charity case, like someone his successful fiancé was burdened with supporting. He'd made jokes about my unemployment, suggested I get a job at Target or volunteer at a food bank to stay busy. He'd seated me at the worst table at my own daughter's wedding, introduced me to his colleagues as a loser. And all the while, I'd been worth more than his entire family combined. The money, David started, then stopped, swallowing hard. What happened to the money? Harrison looked uncomfortable for the first time since the conversation began, perhaps sensing he'd stepped into family territory that was none of his business. But the question hung in the air, and I found myself answering not because David deserved to know, but because Sarah did. I invested it, I said simply. Conservative investments, diversified portfolio. The returns have been adequate. Adequate enough that you've never actually needed to work, David said. And it wasn't a question. His voice held a hollow quality, like a man watching his world collapse in real time. I met his eyes steadily. I've never needed to work for money, no. But I've spent the last 25 years working at the most important job I've ever had, being Sarah's mother. Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Mom, the student loans. You've been paying my student loans, haven't you? And the rent on my first apartment and the car repairs and... Her voice trailed off as understanding dawned. You've been taking care of me this whole time, and I never knew. You were never supposed to know, I said gently. You were supposed to feel proud of your independence, confident in your achievements. Everything you've accomplished, you've earned. But I haven't, Sarah said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. If you've been helping me financially this whole time. You earned your degree through your own hard work. You got your job through your own talent and determination. You built your career through your own efforts. I reached out to touch her arm. I just made sure money was never an obstacle to your dreams. David was staring at me like I was a stranger, which I suppose I was. You let me, God, Margaret, you let me call you a loser. You let me suggest you get a job at McDonald's. You sat there while my mother patronized you about finding purpose in your golden years. His voice was rising now, drawing curious glances from other guests. Why didn't you say anything? The question I'd been dreading for years, the one I'd asked myself countless times during David's subtle humiliations and not so subtle dismissals. Why had I stayed silent? Why had I let him diminish me in front of my own daughter? Because, I said slowly, thinking through the answer even as I spoke it, I didn't need you to understand my choices. I didn't need your approval or your respect. I knew who I was and what I'd accomplished. Your opinion of me never mattered. It was true, I realized as I said it. David's judgment had stung, yes, but it hadn't changed anything fundamental about who I was or what I'd achieved. I'd built an empire and walked away from it by choice. I'd raised a daughter who was confident, successful, and kind. I'd made decisions based on love rather than ego, and I'd never regretted them. But it mattered to me, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Mom, I've been embarrassed. Not of you, never of you, but I thought maybe you'd given up on your dreams to raise me, and I felt guilty about that. But I also felt like maybe you hadn't been ambitious enough, hadn't wanted enough for yourself. The admission hit me harder than any of David's insults ever had. My daughter, my brilliant, accomplished daughter, had been embarrassed by me. All my efforts to spare her the burden of my sacrifice, and I'd created a different burden instead. I've spent my whole adult life trying to make up for what I thought you'd lost, Sarah continued. Working extra hard, achieving extra much, trying to justify why you'd scaled back your career. And all this time, you hadn't scaled back anything. You'd made the biggest, most successful decision of your life. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he'd walked into a family moment that was far more complex than he'd anticipated. Perhaps I should leave you all to... No, please stay, Sarah said quickly, wiping her eyes. I want to hear more about my mother's work. I want to know about the woman I never really knew. So Harrison told her. He told her about the first time he'd met me, a young lawyer with more money than sense, looking to make his first real estate investment. How I'd spent hours explaining not just the deal structure, but the fundamentals of commercial real estate, making sure he understood every risk and every opportunity. He told her about the Riverside complex, how I'd taken a contaminated brownfield site that no one else would touch and turned it into a model of sustainable development, how I'd fought the city council for months to get the zoning changes needed, how I'd worked with environmental groups to ensure the cleanup exceeded all federal standards, how I'd designed green spaces that became a model for urban planning nationwide. He told her about the Morrison Building, the first project he'd hired Thompson Construction for after our initial meeting, how I'd come in under budget and ahead of schedule, despite discovering foundation problems that would have bankrupted a less experienced firm, how I'd absorbed the cost overruns myself rather than pass them on to a client who'd trusted me with his life savings. Your mother didn't just build buildings, Harrison said. She built relationships. She built trust. She built a reputation that opened doors for everyone who worked with her. He paused, looking at me with something approaching awe. And she walked away from all of it at the peak of her success. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How much courage that takes? Sarah was crying openly now, mascara streaking down her cheeks despite the waterproof promises of her makeup artist. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? Why did you let me think you'd just settled? I thought about how to answer that, how to explain 25 years of choices, of priorities, of deliberate decisions to stay in the background of my daughter's story. Because, I said finally, I didn't want you to feel obligated to live up to my success. I wanted you to define success for yourself, to chase your own dreams without the pressure of my legacy hanging over you. I smiled through my own tears, and because being your mother was never settling, it was the greatest privilege of my life. David had been silent throughout Harrison's stories, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. Shame, certainly, regret, but also something else, a kind of desperate calculation, as if he was trying to figure out how to undo the damage he'd done. Margaret, he said suddenly, his voice urgent, I need you to know that I never meant... Yes, you did, I interrupted gently but firmly. You meant exactly what you said. You looked at a woman who didn't fit your definition of success, and you decided I was worth less than you. You made assumptions based on appearances, and you treated me accordingly. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But if you had known I was wealthy, you would have treated me better, I said. That says everything about your character and nothing about mine. The truth of it hung between us, undeniable and damning. David hadn't been cruel because he thought I was poor. He'd been cruel because he thought poor people deserved cruelty. Learning about my wealth didn't change the man he was. It only changed the target of his respect. Sarah seemed to understand this too. I watched her face as she looked at her new husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. She was seeing him the way I'd seen him for months, not as the charming, successful man who'd swept her off her feet, but as someone whose kindness was conditional, whose respect had to be earned through net worth statements and job titles. "David," she said quietly, "I need some air. Will you give me and my mother a few minutes alone?" It wasn't really a request, and David seemed to recognize that. He nodded stiffly, shot one last anguished look at Harrison, who was studiously examining his champagne flute, and walked away toward the bar with the mechanical movements of a man in shock. Harrison cleared his throat. "I should probably circulate," he said diplomatically. "Margaret, it really was wonderful seeing you again. And Sarah, congratulations on your wedding. You have an extraordinary mother." After he left, Sarah and I stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the reception swirling around us. Laughter and music and the clink of glasses, the soundtrack of a celebration that suddenly felt very far away. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Sarah said finally, for David, for not knowing, for not asking the right questions. "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "David's behavior is not your responsibility." "But I let it happen," she said. "I saw how he treated you, and I convinced myself it was just personality differences. I told myself you didn't mind, that you understood he came from a different world." "Different values," I corrected. "Not different world, different values." Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what to do now. I mean, I just married him. We just took vows. But knowing what I know now, seeing who he really is," I took her hands in mine, these capable hands that had built spreadsheets and marketing campaigns, that had shaken hands with clients and signed contracts, that had just hours ago slipped a wedding ring onto the finger of a man who'd revealed himself to be someone neither of us had truly known. "You don't have to do anything right now," I said. "This is your wedding day. Tomorrow, next week, next month. That's when you figure out what comes next." "But how can I just go back to pretending everything's normal? How can I dance with him and smile for photos and act like he didn't just humiliate my mother at my own wedding?" It was a fair question. How do you unknow something? How do you go back to loving someone after they've shown you who they really are? "You can't," I said simply, "and you shouldn't. But you also don't have to make any permanent decisions tonight. Give yourself time to process this. Give yourself space to think clearly." Sarah nodded, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her wanted to march over to David right now and demand answers, demand apologies, demand he somehow become the man she'd thought she was marrying. But part of her also knew, as I'd learned long ago, that some revelations can't be taken back. We stood together in the corner of her wedding reception, mother and daughter, while around us the celebration continued. David's family laughed at some joke his father was telling. The band played a song I remembered from Sarah's childhood, something she used to dance to in our living room on Saturday mornings. The cake waited to be cut. The bouquet waited to be tossed. The traditions waited to be honored. But something fundamental had shifted, and we both knew it. The woman David had married was not the same woman who would wake up tomorrow morning. She was no longer just Sarah Morrison, the marketing executive who'd worked her way up through talent and determination. She was also the daughter of Margaret Thompson, the woman who'd built an empire and chosen love over legacy. And David Morrison was no longer just her charming husband with the prestigious job and the respected family. He was the man who'd called her mother a loser at their own wedding reception, who'd judged worth by wealth and respect by resume, who'd revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person her mother had spent 25 years shielding her from. The music played on, but the dance had changed completely.